Hi, welcome to Conflict Story, where we bring you the best and most fascinating stories just for you. Let's dive right into one of those stories. It begins like this.
I never thought I'd find myself in a standoff with the homeowner association president over my newly installed koi pond, but that's exactly what unfolded last spring. In hindsight, the warning signs about Karen, our overzealous homeowner association president, were glaring. At the time, though, I had no inkling of just how far she'd go to stake a claim over something that wasn't hers. My name is Ethan, and I've lived in the Willow Creek community for about 6 years. It's a charming little neighborhood with picturesque gardens and a mix of modern and traditional homes. When I first moved in, I was drawn to the neighborhood's friendly vibe and amenities like the community garden, walking trails, and a modest fitness center. The homeowner association fees were steep, but I figured they'd be worth it to keep everything looking pristine. The rules seemed manageable. Basic stuff like maintaining your lawn and keeping garbage bins out of sight. Nothing too extreme. For the first few years, everything ran smoothly. I kept up with the guidelines, got along with my neighbors, and thoroughly enjoyed the amenities. But then Karen was elected homeowner association president, and everything began to spiral. Karen, a woman in her early 60s with an air of entitlement and a penchant for micromanagement, quickly turned the homeowner association into her personal fiefdom. She paraded through the neighborhood like a monarch, clipboard in hand, ready to pounce on any perceived infraction. At first, it was just minor annoyances, letters chastising homeowners for leaving their porch lights on too long or for having unauthorized doormats. But her rules grew increasingly absurd, banning certain patio furniture colors, restricting the number of potted plants on porches, and even implementing a curfew for outdoor activities. Many neighbors grumbled, but Karen had a loyal clique of enforcers on the homeowner association board who rubber-stamped her decisions. Anyone who dared to question her faced a barrage of nitpicky violation notices. Most people opted to stay off her radar entirely. I managed to avoid Karen's wrath for years, but everything changed when I decided to fulfill a dream of mine: building a koi pond in my backyard. After years of saving and careful planning, I hired a professional landscaper to create a serene water garden, complete with lily pads, cascading rocks, and a few colorful koi fish. It was a private oasis, tucked into a secluded corner of my fenced yard. For a blissful week, I enjoyed my new retreat. The sound of trickling water and the sight of the koi gliding through the pond brought me an unparalleled sense of peace. But then came the knock on my door. Standing there was Karen, clutching her ever-present clipboard and wearing a look of grim determination. "Good afternoon, Ethan," she began, her tone icy. "I'm here about the unapproved water feature in your yard." I blinked, caught off guard. "Unapproved? You mean my koi pond? I got all the necessary city permits for that." Karen's smile was thin and humorless. "Permits or not, you failed to submit the project to the Homeowner Association Architectural Committee for review. That's a direct violation of our bylaws." I fought the urge to sigh. "Karen, I wasn't aware I needed homeowner association approval for something in my fenced backyard. But if it's required, I'll happily submit the paperwork now." Karen's eyes gleamed with triumph. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. The architectural committee only meets quarterly. The next meeting isn't for 6 weeks. In the meantime, the pond must be removed." I stared at her in disbelief. "Remove it? That's not happening. This pond is professionally installed, and I followed every legal requirement. I'll submit whatever documents you need, but the pond stays." Karen's face flushed. "You're leaving me no choice. You'll be fined $100 per day until the violation is rectified." "Fine me all you want," I said evenly. "I'll contest it." Karen's smile returned, colder than ever. "We'll see about that." She turned sharply and marched away, leaving me fuming. True to her word, the fines began arriving in my mailbox the next day. I ignored them, confident in my legal standing. I also submitted a formal application to the architectural committee, complete with detailed plans and photos. Predictably, Karen, as the committee chair, rejected it outright, claiming the pond disrupted the harmony of the neighborhood. It was clear this was no longer about bylaws. It was personal. A month into the standoff, Karen escalated. One Saturday morning, I was tending to the pond when I heard voices. I turned to see Karen and two homeowner association board members stepping into my yard. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded, striding over to confront them. Karen didn't flinch. "We're here to conduct an inspection. Homeowner association bylaws grant us the right to access any property to investigate violations." "That's nonsense, and you know it," I shot back. "This is private property. Leave now, or I'm calling the police." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You're obstructing the homeowner association's duties, Ethan? That's another violation." One of the board members, a timid man named Greg, mumbled, "Maybe we should come back later." Karen silenced him with a glare. "No, we're finishing this now." She stepped onto my deck, ignoring my protests. When she leaned over the pond as if to inspect the water quality, I snapped. "No, that's it. I'm calling the cops," I said, pulling out my phone. Karen scoffed. "Go ahead. I'll tell them you're harassing me. We'll see who they believe." Minutes later, two police officers arrived. After hearing both sides, they informed Karen that homeowner association bylaws didn't override trespassing laws and advised her to leave. Furious but unwilling to risk arrest, she retreated, vowing that this wasn't over. Little did I know, Karen was far from finished. She'd go to even greater lengths to enforce her twisted interpretation of the rules. But I was just as determined to stand my ground. The battle for my koi pond had only begun. The fallout from Karen's failed inspection was swift. Within days, I began receiving an onslaught of violation notices in my mailbox. Each one cited increasingly absurd infractions, from the unapproved color of my lawn furniture to the lack of conformity in my choice of backyard plants. It was clear Karen was determined to bury me in paperwork, hoping I'd either cave under the pressure or simply give up. But if she thought I'd fold that easily, she didn't know me at all. The situation escalated further the following week when I discovered a bright orange notice of non-compliance posted on my front door. It was signed by Karen herself, declaring my koi pond a hazard to community safety and ordering its immediate removal. The notice claimed the pond's proximity to the property line violated homeowner association guidelines. A blatant lie, as I'd ensured it was well within the required setbacks. Worse still, the notice threatened daily fines of $500 if I didn't comply. I decided it was time to take action. First, I consulted with a local attorney who specialized in homeowner association disputes. After reviewing the homeowner association's bylaws and my documentation, she confirmed what I already knew. Karen was acting far beyond her authority. The fines, the notices, and the attempted inspection were all baseless. My attorney advised me to file a formal complaint with the Homeowner Association Board and, if necessary, prepare for legal action. With my lawyer's help, I drafted a detailed letter outlining Karen's harassment and her numerous violations of homeowner association protocol. I also included copies of my permits, a survey of my property showing the pond's compliance with all regulations, and photographs documenting her unauthorized entry into my yard. I submitted the complaint directly to the Homeowner Association Board, bypassing Karen entirely. To ensure it didn't mysteriously disappear, I sent copies to every board member via certified mail. A few days later, I received an email from Greg, the timid board member who had accompanied Karen during her so-called inspection. He apologized profusely for the misunderstanding and assured me the board would review my complaint at their next meeting. While his tone was conciliatory, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's influence still loomed large. That suspicion was confirmed when, the day before the board meeting, I noticed a crew of landscapers loitering near my house. Curious, I stepped outside to investigate. To my shock, they were unloading equipment onto my front lawn. "What are you doing?" I called out. One of the workers, a burly man in a green uniform, glanced at a clipboard. "We're here to remove the water feature per homeowner association orders," he said. My blood boiled. "You're not touching anything on this property," I snapped. "This so-called order is completely illegal." The man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, lady named Karen hired us. Said it was all approved." I grabbed my phone and started recording. "This is private property. Unless you want to be charged with trespassing and destruction of property, I suggest you leave." That got their attention. After a brief whispered discussion, the crew packed up and left, though not without a few dirty looks. I immediately called my attorney, who advised me to file a police report to document the incident. When the day of the board meeting arrived, the community center was packed. Word had spread about the koi pond drama, and nearly every homeowner had shown up. Karen stood at the front of the room, her usual smug demeanor replaced with thinly veiled irritation. As the meeting began, she launched into a speech about upholding community standards and protecting property values. It was clear she planned to paint me as a rogue homeowner, causing chaos in the neighborhood. When it was my turn to speak, I laid everything out. The permits, the bylaws, the attempted inspection, and the landscaper's unauthorized visit. I even played the video of the crew admitting Karen had hired them. The room erupted into murmurs, and several neighbors shot Karen disapproving looks. "This is a clear abuse of power," I said, directing my words at the board. "Karen has overstepped her authority time and time again, using her position to harass and intimidate homeowners. This isn't about community standards. It's about her personal vendetta." Greg, looking increasingly uncomfortable, finally spoke up. "Ethan's right. We never approved any action against the pond. Karen acted on her own." Karen's face turned beet red. "That's not true," she spluttered. "The board supported my decision." "No, we didn't," interrupted another board member, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda. "And frankly, I'm tired of you making unilateral decisions that bring embarrassment to this community." The crowd erupted into applause. Several neighbors stood to voice their own grievances: unjust fines, arbitrary rules, and Karen's heavy-handed tactics. It became clear that her reign of terror had alienated nearly everyone. Sensing the tide had turned, Linda made a motion to hold a vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership. The motion passed overwhelmingly. As Karen stood there, stunned and speechless, Linda announced that an interim president would be appointed until a formal election could be held. As I left the meeting, neighbors approached me to offer their support. "Thanks for standing up to her," one woman said. "We've all been too afraid to speak out." "I just wanted to protect my koi pond," I replied, though I couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing Karen finally held accountable. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. In the days following Karen's ousting, the atmosphere in the Willow Creek community shifted noticeably. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves now greeted each other with knowing smiles, as if collectively relieved to be free from her tyranny. While the interim homeowner association president, Linda, worked to stabilize the board and undo Karen's more draconian policies, I thought the koi pond drama might finally be behind me. But Karen wasn't one to go quietly. About a week after the fateful meeting, I received an envelope in the mail bearing the return address of a local law firm. Inside was a formal cease and desist letter accusing me of defamation and damaging Karen's professional reputation. The letter demanded that I issue a public apology and remove my koi pond within 7 days or face legal action. It was a desperate last-ditch effort to intimidate me, and it had Karen's fingerprints all over it. I immediately forwarded the letter to my attorney, who assured me it was nothing more than a scare tactic. "She's grasping at straws," my attorney said. "We'll draft a response to shut this down." In our reply, we firmly denied Karen's claims and warned that any further harassment would result in a countersuit for abusive process. My lawyer also included a reminder that Karen's own actions during her homeowner association presidency had been well documented and widely criticized by the community. I could only imagine her reaction when she received that letter. Despite her legal threat fizzling out, Karen wasn't done stirring up trouble. One afternoon, as I was feeding the koi, I noticed a figure lingering on the sidewalk near my house. It was Karen, her arms crossed and her gaze fixed on my backyard. She looked like she was waiting for something, though for what, I couldn't guess. Eventually, she walked up my driveway and called out, "Ethan, I'd like to have a word." I set down the fish food and walked to the gate, keeping my tone neutral. "What do you want, Karen?" "I think we got off on the wrong foot," she began, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "I'd like to discuss a compromise regarding the koi pond." I raised an eyebrow. "A compromise?" "Yes," she said, stepping closer. "I've spoken to a few neighbors, and they agree the pond is a bit excessive. If you're willing to scale it back, perhaps remove the water feature entirely and replace it with a simple garden, I'm sure we can avoid any further unpleasantness." I couldn't help but laugh. "Karen, let me make this clear. The pond isn't going anywhere. I've followed every rule and regulation, and the Homeowner Association Board has already reviewed and approved it. If you're looking for a fight, you won't win." Her expression darkened. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. "This neighborhood deserves better than your tacky vanity projects." I held her gaze unflinching. And this neighborhood deserves better than a petty tyrant who abuses her power. Goodbye, Karen. She turned on her heel and stormed off, muttering under her breath. I watched her go, certain that she was already plotting her next move. Sure enough, her campaign against me took a new turn the following weekend. Flyers began appearing on mailboxes throughout the neighborhood, decrying my koi pond as a safety hazard and environmental blight. The flyers were unsigned, but the inflammatory language and overly dramatic tone made it obvious who was behind them. At first, I ignored the smear campaign. Most of my neighbors saw through Karen's antics and either laughed them off or voiced their support for me. But when I caught one of her allies stapling the flyers to a community bulletin board, I decided enough was enough. I called Linda, the interim homeowner association president, to report the incident. To my surprise, she was already aware of the flyers. Ethan, I'm so sorry, Linda said. We've been trying to stop Karen's nonsense, but she's been distributing these flyers under the radar. I'll call an emergency board meeting to address this. True to her word, Linda organized a meeting for the following Tuesday. The room was packed, with nearly every homeowner in attendance. Karen sat near the back, flanked by a handful of her loyal supporters, her expression smug. Linda opened the meeting with a sharp rebuke. We are here to address the continued harassment and misinformation campaign being waged against one of our residents. Let me be perfectly clear. This behavior is unacceptable and will not be tolerated. Karen immediately stood up. Harassment? Misinformation? I'm simply advocating for the community's best interests. By spreading falsehoods and defacing community property? Linda shot back. Your actions are not only disruptive, but also a violation of homeowner association policies. Several neighbors chimed in, voicing their frustration with Karen's behavior. One woman held up a flyer, pointing out the inaccuracies and exaggerations. Another neighbor recounted how Karen had pressured him to join her crusade, threatening to target his property if he refused. As the testimonies piled up, Karen's bravado began to crumble. By the end of the meeting, the board unanimously voted to ban her from distributing materials without prior approval and warned her that any further harassment could result in legal action. For the first time, Karen had no snappy retort. She left the meeting in silence, her head held high but her defeat unmistakable. That evening, I stood by the koi pond, watching the fish glide peacefully through the water. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm returning to the neighborhood. Karen might not be finished yet, but her influence was waning, and the community was stronger for it. The koi pond saga wasn't over, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't backing down. The final showdown over my koi pond came sooner than expected. Karen, true to form, refused to accept her dwindling influence. She found new ways to needle me, filing frivolous complaints with city inspectors and attempting to rally what remained of her supporters. Her determination was relentless, but so was my resolve to see this through to the end. One afternoon, I noticed a city vehicle parked outside my house. A man in a hard hat was speaking to Karen on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. Curious, I stepped outside to find out what was going on. "Excuse me," I said, walking up to them. "Can I help you?" Karen's face lit up with smug satisfaction. "This is Mr. Lawson from the city's building department. I reported your pond as a code violation, and he's here to investigate." Mr. Lawson glanced at me, clearly uncomfortable. Yes, I'm just here to check the paperwork and ensure everything is up to code." "That's no problem," I replied calmly. "I have all the permits and documentation inside. Would you like to see them?" Karen's expression faltered. "Permits? I don't believe that's necessary," she interjected. Mr. Lawson raised a hand to cut her off. "Actually, ma'am, it is necessary. If the homeowner has the proper permits, then there's no issue." I invited Mr. Lawson into my home and handed him the folder containing every permit, survey, and receipt related to the koi pond's construction. He reviewed them meticulously, nodding as he went. When he finished, he shook his head and sighed. "Everything's in order here," he said, stepping back outside. "There are no violations." Karen's face turned bright red. "That's impossible. There must be something wrong. What about the water runoff? Or the proximity to the fence line?" "Everything checks out," Mr. Lawson repeated firmly. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to stop filing baseless complaints. It wastes everyone's time." Karen sputtered incoherently as he got into his truck and drove away. I couldn't help but smile as I watched her flounder. The following week, the Homeowner Association held its official election for president. To no one's surprise, Karen threw her hat in the ring, desperate to reclaim her lost power. But this time, the community had seen enough. Her name was met with groans and eye rolls as neighbors filed into the community center to cast their votes. Linda, who had served admirably as interim president, ran against Karen, promising transparency and a renewed focus on collaboration. I also noticed several new candidates running for board positions, neighbors who had previously stayed silent but now felt emboldened to make a change. When the results were announced later that evening, Linda won by a landslide. Karen didn't even come close. In fact, none of her remaining allies managed to secure seats on the board. It was a clean sweep, and the room erupted in applause as the new leadership team took the stage. Karen stood at the back, her face a mask of fury. She stormed out before the meeting concluded, leaving behind a neighborhood that had finally united against her divisive antics. In the days that followed, the new board worked quickly to repair the damage Karen had caused. They repealed many of her arbitrary rules, clarified the bylaws, and even set up a committee to handle disputes fairly and transparently. The atmosphere in Willow Creek improved dramatically. Neighbors who had once been at odds were now chatting amicably at block parties and community events. As for my koi pond, it became something of a neighborhood attraction. Families would stop by to admire the fish and chat about their own garden projects. The pond had gone from being a source of conflict to a symbol of resilience and community spirit. One evening, as I stood by the water's edge, watching the koi glide gracefully beneath the surface, Linda stopped by with a bottle of wine. "Thought you might want to celebrate," she said, handing me the bottle. "You've been through a lot." I smiled and gestured toward the pond. "I think we all have, but it's worth it to see the neighborhood come together like this." Linda nodded. "Karen underestimated how much people were willing to stand up for what's right. You were the first to push back, and it made all the difference." As we toasted to a brighter future for Willow Creek, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we'd come. The koi pond had started as a personal dream, but had grown into something much larger, a rallying point for a community determined to reclaim its identity. Are you hungry for more slices of stories? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to never miss out on any videos. See you tomorrow.